what you're saying feels very parallel to a lot of the criticisms that I make of the public education system and the way we treat education, particularly in America, but honestly on a global scale, where there's a one-size-fits-all path that appears to have variance, because you can choose to be a STEM kid. You can choose to be heavily focused on history. You can choose to be on an AP track. You can choose to go to community college or try to get into an Ivy League. You can choose to be on like pre-med or pre-law. You can choose to take one of these career preparedness tracks that's going to spit you out into all different sorts of careers. So it feels highly varied, but it's all a singular system, and we're trying to fit everyone into it. And the building blocks of it, the core sort of things that you have to do to succeed inside the system, are extremely standardized, which means they really weren't designed to tailor fit anyone, and they're designed to the mean. So they're going to sort of meet you at the middle of where the population is at large, and some people are going to fit better than others, and it's not going to fit anybody exactly right. And then we have all of these kids and young adults who are horribly struggling inside of the system, and they grow up thinking that they're stupid, or that they're like not good at school, or just not very intelligent, which is such a tragedy for a child to grow up with this huge self-esteem issue that's inflicted on them by a system that they were forced to try to fit. And they see these paths that look like a buffet of options, but really aren't. And if none of them fit you quite right, you think it's a you problem and not a system problem.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, like, it's easier to sort of pinpoint it when you're talking about the schooling system, because you can really, like, lots of people have dissected this and written about it and like made it very clear. They put it into language that we can all interchangeably use and understand. And, you know, a system's a very tangible thing to, like, it has a process to it. It has buildings and you can critique it. And what you're talking about feels very similar, but a little more ephemeral. It's a little harder to put your fingers on and be like, okay, this is exactly what is happening, but it feels like a very similar phenomenon that you're describing.
Well, I think that as I started going down this journey, really in a way, the areas I was concerned with and found fascinating began to change from like being sort of systems oriented and economics interested to being interested in the way psychology interacts with that. Probably because of Jonathan Haidt and Jordan Peterson more than to any other people. And I think that led me to see a couple things as being fundamental, which is, and like, this is like psychology 101, but having an internal locus of control is so fundamentally important. And what is that? It's believing that your choices matter and that you have agency, that I can choose. I can choose how to respond to my circumstances. I can choose what to think, even though thoughts pop into our head, which is also kind of weird. Like when we observe a thought pop into our head, where did that come from? That's complete. How do I have a thing that observes another thing in my head? That's real weird. But I ultimately choose how I respond emotionally to what other people say and do to me, even though I feel like I can't because my emotions occur at stimulus response, but I still ultimately choose. So that's the internal locus of control. And basically this basic idea underpins happiness. Happy people have an internal locus of control. Unhappy people, anxious people don't.
Have you read Peter Gray, just very quickly?
Oh, yeah. And I interviewed Peter Gray, actually.
Yeah, very, very similar.
Yeah. Free to Learn. Incredible book. He's awesome.
Very similar idea.
And yeah, and in that book, one of the things he talks about is that play is how children learn. And it has been the way they've always learned. And he looks at in like sort of indigenous, I find this sort of silly word, but it's like, well, indigenous in what time period? But sort of, simpler peoples.
Mm-hmm. The hunter-gatherer
Hunter-gatherers and tribes, pre-industrial societies and communities. What you will find is, right, basically starting around the age of reason, like 7 to 10, they kind of form little bands and play at what the adults do. So the boys go around throwing spears and playing like hunter, and yes, on average, the little girls make dolls. You can do this now. You can on average, you can give a little girl a toy truck and she will turn it into a baby carriage on average. Not all the time. It's a curve. Some will say, I want to take this car apart, like my best friend Courtney, who's now an engineer, and say like, and her and I were both playing Legos together. But on average, if you're going to close your eyes and guess and throw a dart, you're probably going to land on playing with dolls or throwing spears and beating each other up, boys and girls. So that play is really interesting because play is how we learn, according to Peter, and I think that's absolutely true. Then you look at the fact that we don't tend to remember things that we don't find useful or interesting. So Mike Gibson, who wrote The Paper Belt on Fire, talks about this in his book and in all his writing. He runs a 1517 fund, which invests in basically college dropouts.
Good friend of mine. I've had him on the show.
He's a member of our board, dear friend, great guy, terrific. And he's like, yeah, you look at all the pedagogical study data and people don't remember anything. They take a class and like 1% remember any of it, like relatively recently after completing the class. So then what do we remember? Well, we remember the things that we find interesting and important. And that's just a fact. And it's amazing how much we can remember when we find it interesting and important. The things we can conjure in our mind, that somewhere in those recesses, it's there because we found it interesting and important, or because we played with it. And like none of that has it's as if in our current school system, which was inspired by these like proto-Nazi Prussians that wanted to basically make sure that the next generation of soldiers wouldn't abandon their post, and then got, adopted by the Rockefellers as like, this is a great way to make sure that in this sort of early industrial era, they won't abandon their slot as Rosie the Riveter, our beloved Rosie the Riveter. Those jobs are freaking boring for the most part.
Yeah, but her bandana was cool.
Yeah, she was awesome. Love Rosie the Riveter. But if you really wish we could get back to 1950s manufacturing jobs, I think you should try one for a while and see how much you like being Rosie the Riveter.
Wait, are people really arguing to bring back 1950s manufacturing jobs?
Isn't that most of the right and the left now? It's like Elizabeth Warren and Orrin Cass are like arm in arm, like, we got to bring back industrial manufacturing to the United States so we can rebuild the middle class like Rosie the Riveter. It's like, okay, all right. Those jobs kind of suck. I'm sorry, they do. I mean, every job is good. Every job has dignity. It's like, not every job's got to be super interesting. I'm a guy that likes to work with my hands, but like assembly line, I'm glad robots do that. So we just don't, we don't have a system that supports any of the things that the people that seem to honestly want to understand learning do. Like, we don't have a system built on play. We don't have a system built on a large degree of self-direction so that your interests can help guide you.
Or even learning science, like all of the research that's been done over the past 5 decades around how people retain knowledge, things like spaced repetition and active recall, like none of that's implemented in the classroom. And it's because it's not scalable with the teacher in front of the classroom model, but no one's even tried. Like AI is going to change all of that very quickly.
Yeah, I actually think that the education space is probably the place for the most amount of AI optimism insofar as as I understand it, and this is mostly from people like Michael Strong and Mike Gibson, one-on-one instruction works and has always been the thing that works.
It works brilliantly because you can tailor exactly to where the child is and move at exactly their pace.
And we had this whole, so like there's all these stories we tell in America that are just ahistoric. Oh, you know, the Northeast, like in Massachusetts, they were great because they had the first public school system, and Horace Mann is such a saint. It's like Massachusetts had 98% literacy before there were public schools.
Nobody likes that part of the story.
It's like they already had it. It's like, if anything, this was like the success. This was like the innovator's dilemma. They were already a hyper-educated culture. And then they decided to wreck it by building public schools. That, and they wanted to try to like get the damn dirty Catholics to like abandon the Pope. That was really what it boiled down to. How do we give this away for free? Because we got all these Irish and Catholics coming in, and they're papists, and they're not going to be good American Nordics like the rest of us. Blah, blah, blah. I'll give them away school for free. I mean, the best thing about real history is the people who I do think are ultimately, they had their own version of good intentions, but I still consider them fundamentally to be villains. They said all the bad stuff out loud.
If you look through the documents of the people who founded our public education system, it's quite shocking.
They're horrible. It's like you read John Taylor Gatto and he brings the receipts, and the receipts are gross. This is like a bunch of creepy eugenics and, you know, central planning weirdos that don't particularly like children or humanity.
No. And they just want everybody to be quiet and stay in their lane.
Yeah.
There's I'm going to butcher the paraphrase of this, but there's a quote that's like I think it's from like the founding documents of the Board of Education or something like that, where they're like, we are not going to try to raise poets and artists because we already have a vast supply, referring to like all of the children going to private schools of the founding class. It's like we don't need them to be creative. It's going to distract from their manufacturing jobs.
There's a great guy. I've known him for a while named James Tooley. You've probably heard of his book, The Beautiful Tree.
Mm-hmm.
He had been like a radical Marxist that worked for Robert Mugabe. He's a Brit. And at some point he discovered that, and I believe he started in India, and like the equivalent to a favelas in India, the sort of slums, that the majority of desperately poor people in India, and then he proceeded to travel all around the world and find basically all around the world, the poorest of the poor are getting better educated in for-profit private schools that $2 a day families pay for with their own money, even though there is a free public school in their area. Why? Because the free public school sucks.
It's actually really surprising. Like, so many kids in India go to private school.
It's all. And so you hear this thing in America that like, oh, if you're like a radical like us and you want to abolish the public school system because it's basically it's everything the left says they hate about colonialism and capitalism. It's like it is literally an actual system of conformity and oppression. The public school system. That we somehow hate the poor, or we want people to slip through the cracks. It's like, well, number one, the poorest of the poor are being better educated by private schools worldwide. So you're just wrong. Like if I'm going to pull out my falsification tool, your theory is busted. Second, I lived in New Jersey for years. And in some ways, I almost feel like I'm from Jersey because I would spend every summer on the Jersey Shore. New Jersey has a system in which the poorest school districts actually spend the most money per student. It was a series of rulings called the Abbott rulings by the Supreme Court of New Jersey, basically saying like, well, our state constitution says that we are obligated to provide a good education. And through interpretation of that, they forced the New Jersey school system to really be highly redistributing in terms of financial resources. So like Newark, New Jersey, I think they might be spending north of $40,000 per student per year. And you think, okay, that's a lot of friggin' money. Where does it all go? Because the schools are terrible. And actually, like Cory Booker, when he was the mayor of Newark, was really like a pro school choice guy because he was seeing it firsthand as the mayor of the city. And I won't for a second back down from the moral high ground that we need to pull our kids out of these schools, put them in something different. We need to be warriors to defund this catastrophe and arm families to the best extent possible with other options.